Um, we have with us today Rolf Diamond. He's an author. He's a former National Park superintendent. He's an historian, and as an author, he has a book coming out. Did it come out yet, Ralph, or it's coming out this week?
I think it's out. I've seen it in bookstores. Amazon's selling it to people, so it's out there as of this week, formally.
Okay. It's called Olmsted and Yosemite, the Civil War, Abolition, and the National Park Idea. And he's here today to tell us about the book and national parks. And I'll turn it over to you. We're really pleased to have him because he's starting to promote his book the end of this week, and he'll be really busy. So we were lucky to get him right now before that all gets moved.
Well, my good fortune, and I'm pleased to have an opportunity to chat and maybe answer some questions. I'll try to keep my presentation to about 30 minutes or 35 minutes, and we have a little time to take some questions and have a little conversation afterwards. That would be great. I'm going to show a series of slides, and this, as I was saying just a little bit earlier, this book revisits the history of national parks and some of the narratives or stories associated with the foundation or the founding of the national parks and the founding of the National Park Service. Which were two different events, and I'll explain a little bit of the chronology. But let me begin with some images, and it's much easier to sort of follow what I'm saying if you see a few images. So I'm going to start that process now, so bear with me here. All right, at this point, I hope everyone can see the first image. If you can, yes. Let me know. Okay, good. All right. So this, let me start with there are a couple of, I would have to say myths associated with the founding of the national parks. There is a story that the idea for national parks occurred in the 1870s during the exploration of the area around Madison Junction, which is now in Yellowstone. And that a group of hardy pioneers, and this is a photograph, is a reenactment of this, actually this somewhat mythical event where they purportedly were sitting around a campfire and came up with the idea of a national park. It's later been proven that this conversation, even though the expedition occurred, this conversation likely didn't. But all the same, it became the official story of the National Park Service because to some it seems such a good story. Later, after this, the Yosemite story was more or less debunked. The Yellowstone story. There was the second purported birthplace of the national park idea was Yosemite in 1903. When Teddy Roosevelt stopped by and spent a night camping with John Muir in Yosemite Valley, and supposedly that's where the idea of the national parks came from. So another story, also embellished. There's no question the two met, and here's a photograph of them, in fact, standing on the backdrop to Yosemite Falls. But national parks had been created at that point in 1903. They had been created 30 years earlier. Yellowstone was almost 30 years earlier. And the National Park Service itself as an organization wasn't created for another 13 years, long after Roosevelt left office and John Muir had in fact died. So the idea that these are the two fathers of the National Park Service is exaggeration by a large measure. So what I'm going to be talking about today is taking the history of the national parks back from 1903 or 1872 all the way back to the 1860s and the American Civil War, and the influence and that's a picture of Yosemite on the left, but the influence of these two people in particular. On the right, you should all recognize Abraham Lincoln, who actually signed the legislation creating a park in Yosemite, and the famous landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, who's well known as the designer of New York's Central Park, and there's a picture of one of the bridges in Central Park. But Olmsted was also a key thinker with the creation of a park in Yosemite Valley, and wrote a very influential report at the close of the Civil War in 1865, which not only spoke to the place, the importance of a park in Yosemite, but also set the stage for the creation of a national system of parks throughout the United States. Our story really begins before the Civil War, because this was a very different country than after the war. Obviously, it was a slave republic where there was a vast system of human bondage, an enormously powerful economic force in the United States, and a tremendously powerful political force. The government was pretty weak, and it was deliberately kept weak for a whole bunch of reasons, but basically to support slavery. For example, they did not want to have any direct taxation pre-Civil War, because if there was taxation, slaves might be taxed as property, and therefore slave owners didn't want to depart with any of their massive profits. And so they opposed any taxation. The government was just pretty limited. They didn't want national improvements. For example, they fought a railroad linking East and West. They fought Justin Morrill, our Vermont senator's proposal to create public education institutions with the Land Grant College Act. They basically did not want to provide services to the American people that would strengthen the non-slavery majority population, because by doing so, they felt their power and their control of the government would be imperiled. They wanted slavery to move west so that it'd be more states as slave states for their control of the government. And they wanted a government that was small enough to serve the needs of slave interests, and of course enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. That was something they wanted. But they did block grants of land for all sorts of public purposes. And this was the Republican Party, their opposition, their agenda. This is the party of Lincoln. They wanted grants for, as I said, the land grant colleges, a Homestead Act, the Pacific Railroad Act. And they just wanted to use land for public purposes. And the Southern Democrats and President Buchanan wanted to sell that land because that's how they were running the government, without taxes. The Great Central Park project that was launched just before the war began was a demonstration of what would happen if you invested in civic improvements. And this was undertaken by New York City in the late 1850s. It was the largest, really probably the largest civic project in the United States. And one writer in the Atlantic Monthly commented, the most striking evidence yet of the sovereignty of the people in the history of free institutions, the best answer yet given to the doubts and fears which have frowned on the theory of self-government. In other words, this was an affirmation that American democracy, free and free labor, independent of slavery, could produce great public works and serve a broader cross-section of the public. So there's a different story to the origin myths that I discussed, and that is that this American Parks movement needs to be seen in the context, the wider context of Civil War changes, and I'll discuss some of them, and the struggle to abolish slavery. It was inspired by Central Park, as Olmsted called it, a dramatic development, a democratic development of the highest importance. And it was only made possible by the defeat of slavery and a total Union victory, and the political and social revolution it fueled. In particular, it hinged largely on the emancipation of African Americans in the United States and the participation, in fact, of hundreds of thousands of Black soldiers fighting for the Union, fighting for the United States. Lastly, parks, Yosemite and subsequent national parks like Yellowstone, and I mentioned that there are now 423 national parks today in America. They began to be created once there was an opportunity to use public lands for opportunities other than supporting selling them all for the expansion of slavery or to private landowners to support a slave republic. That once slavery was done away with, the country was dramatically changed, and it was possible to, in fact, envision the use of public lands in ways that served the American people, and not just where land was not just for selling. This is a letter that Sarah Shaw wrote Frederick Law Olmsted in 1861, at the beginning of the war. Sarah Shaw will not be familiar to most of you, if not all of you, but she was the mother of Robert Gould Shaw, who was the officer who commanded the African-American 54th Colored Massachusetts Infantry on the attack on Fort Wagner, and he died along with about 100 of his soldiers. But his mother was a very avid abolitionist and forward-thinking progressive woman, and she wrote Olmsted, "If we can remake the government, abolish slavery, and get Central Park well underway for our descendants, we shall have done a work worthy of the 19th century." And this is a very important quote. For the first time, it connects the idea of remaking the government so it is a non-slave owning government, government that does not condone or support slavery, and also can undertake great public works on behalf of the American people, such as Central Park and our national parks, I may add later. And that was, in her view, an undertaking worthy of the American people in the 19th century. I have to say, in some ways, her aspirations continue to today, where we really are thinking of making sure we have a government that is in service of the people. When the war broke out, of course, and Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and 11 southern states refused to recognize the legitimacy of the election and created an insurrection and seceded from the Union. They also pulled all their congressmen out of Congress. And all of a sudden, Lincoln's Republican Party had a lopsided majority in both the House and the Senate, and were in a position to enact reforms and changes that otherwise had been blocked for many years prior. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a key moment in the Civil War, which is the spring of 1862, a period of about 5 months when the realization finally occurred in the United States that there would be no negotiated peace with the Confederacy. The war would go on until victory, and that there would be no return if at the end of the war to a pre-war status quo. In other words, the United States was going to be a different country coming out of the war than it was going into the war. And starting very early in the war, there were literally thousands and then tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of enslaved people who self-emancipated and escaped to Union lines by the tens of thousands, and became clear that there was no future where they were ever going to be re-enslaved again. And it put a lot of pressure to move forward to emancipation, full emancipation for the entire country. This period I'm talking about is from March to July of 1862. There's the Capitol, still not yet completed. The dome has not yet been added. But Congress is in session, and in those 5 months, they do quite a bit of, they are on overdrive. They resurrect the College Land Grant Act, creating public colleges across the United States that would be available to ordinary people, accessible. So they passed that. They passed a bill linking the East and the West through the Pacific Railroad Act. They passed the Homestead Act, enabling free soil settlers, non-slave owners to get 160 acres of land. They created Department of Agriculture to support independent small farmers. And they pass a series of acts, one of which, for the first time, recognizes and gives freedom to any African American who will take up arms for the United States. And this is revolutionary because it's clear that once someone fights for their country, citizenship is not far behind. And lastly, in July 1862, Lincoln releases the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which begins the road to full emancipation and the ending of slavery in the United States. Another land grant comes along 2 years later with the creation of a park in Yosemite Valley. This is just an extension of this long list of other pieces of legislation. It is, again, a land grant that's made for a public reason, for a public benefit. And that is, and this is a quote from the act, it's to be held for public use, resort, and recreation, and shall be inalienable for all time. In other words, it's land that's not set aside for a month, a year, a decade, but forever. And it really creates the concept, first concept of our national parks. Now, someone asked me about Native Americans, and it's very important to point out that this land was in the public domain because it was taken about a decade earlier, in early 1850s, by some California settlers and militias, and it was taken from the Miwok or Wanichi people who had lived in Yosemite Valley for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They were driven out of the valley, some returned, but this was not a wilderness. This Yosemite had been inhabited by people for a long, long time. And when John Muir came around 20 or 30 years later and said that this was, a temple of wilderness, he was ignoring the fact that people had lived in this landscape and, in fact, shaped it in many ways. The Great Meadows of Yosemite were created by Native Americans who burned the valley floor for crops. So while this is a complicated story, part of it has to acknowledge that there was a great deal of suffering associated with Native Americans. These lands do serve all people of the United States, but they did suffer with the loss of their homeland. Frederick Law Olmsted, I mentioned a little bit earlier, is a key figure in both Central Park and Yosemite. He's our country's first landscape architect, but he's really first known in certain circles as an anti-slavery journalist and activist. He travels throughout the South, reporting for the New York Times. In fact, does 3 trips over a period of 4 or 5 years, reporting on Southern society and the impact of slavery on the political, economic, and social life of the South. And he writes a series of very influential anti-slavery books. He does 3 books, and the 4th book is a compendium of all of them. It's called The Cotton Kingdom, A Traveler's Observation on Cotton and Slavery in the American Slave System. To this day, he's considered one of the keenest observers of the American slave system. Of course, I mentioned he's later becomes one of the creators of Central Park. When the war breaks out, he's lame in one leg and cannot serve in military capacity, but he's supervisor of something called the Sanitary Commission, which was a vast nonprofit organization set up to provide medical services to Union wounded soldiers. And towards the end of the war, he moves to California. And there, because of his reputation with Central Park and his anti-slavery credentials, he's asked, when the Yosemite Valley is made into a public park, he's asked to do a plan for the park and to comment on to write about its meaning for the country. And he produces a report in 1865 as the war draws to a close. And I'll talk about that report in a moment. I just wanted to give you a sense of how important Olmsted's work was to the Civil War. This is a map he did on the top of really it's based on census figures, which shows the population density of enslaved people in the South. And he was the first one to do this kind of demographic mapping. It was later replicated in a map done by something called the U.S. Coastal Survey, which showed in more detail, county by county, where enslaved people were in the United States. And why was this important when the war broke out? The Lincoln administration was quite keen to recruit as many Black soldiers into the Army as possible. And they wanted to know where to find potential recruits, enslaved people who would fight for the United States. And this is, on the right, is a famous painting of Lincoln reading the preliminary draft of the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. And if you look very carefully in the far right corner of Francis Bucknell's painting, you will see a copy of this map. It was used, and here's a blow-up of it in the corner. It was used by Lincoln to guide military and strategic direction of the war. They were very aware of the importance of not only emancipation in theory, but in practice. Now, just a word of what's going on in California during the war. I'll just briefly mention Thomas Starr King. He's a Unitarian minister who goes out to California, to San Francisco, and becomes enthralled with the Yosemite. He'd written a book about the White Mountains in New Hampshire. He was quite a conservationist, but he was also got very active in making sure California did not secede or become independent from the United States, and campaigned through early days of the war to make sure California remained loyal. So he's a very active conservationist, but a very active anti-slavery Republican. And this is important to keep in mind when the time comes around to introduce legislation to protect Yosemite Valley. So that happens in 1864. And the old view of history, and many people have written about this, is they can't understand why Yosemite was protected in this legislation making a park occurred right in the middle of the Civil War. They say, well, Congress had other things to think about in the midst of the war, and they were preoccupied, and why should they ever think about a park? It's inexplicable. And, it runs against all established public lands policy in the United States, which was to sell all government land, to extract every dollar they could from it. So it was an anomaly. It was totally inexplicable. And in our book, we take a very contrary view. We argue, in fact, just the opposite, that the gentleman, Thomas Starr King, that I just introduced, had died from natural causes in 1864, just before the legislation was introduced in the Congress. And there was a great political debt to him because he raised a lot of money for the Union war effort. Plus, he was a great supporter of emancipation. And so being a conservationist, when this bill was introduced in the Congress, there was a political debt to be paid. Also, it was very much in line with the College Land Grant Act, for example. The idea that now the government was prepared to set aside some of the small piece of the public domain for the benefit of the American people. And certainly Yosemite, even though it was a modest act, was very much in line with the legislation of 1862, begun in 1862. And the continued use of land grants for these purposes. And lastly, the war was being fought, and it was very important to find ways to show why it was important to stay on until victory, to fight on until victory. And so Lincoln administration was very anxious to prove the efficacy of government, good government, that it could serve the common people. It was not in the employ of a slave-owning elite anymore. It was to provide broader public services to the American citizen. And this land grant bill, as small as it was in Yosemite, was one example of that. And lastly, it was an affirmation that even while the government was in the midst of fighting a war, it could still carry on and carry out its duties for the American people. And, this was very important when Lincoln was he had to run for re-election in 1864. And he made it a point that he was going to have this election despite the fact the war was going on. And lastly, there's a huge influence of Central Park on the creation of Yosemite. And just very briefly, Central Park was really about capturing incredible scenic views. And you can see from this stereo photograph of Central Park, it was a composition, and that's how they looked at parks, as a composition of landscape features, very much like Yosemite in this stereo pair down below. The same principle was at work. They also, very important in Central Park, was to have a series of pedestrian and carriageways in the park to take people to scenic vistas and to move people through the park, because they envisioned the day when these parks would be used by millions and millions and millions of people, and they needed to be moved through in a way that would not destroy the beauty of the landscape. And the same was at work, really, at a different scale in Yosemite Valley, where very early on, Olmsted proposed a series of trails, but particular carriage roads that would be scenic. Same principle at work. So you could see, despite the fact that Central Park is very different in so many ways from Yosemite, there are some principles that both have in common. And the report he wrote for Yosemite, Olmsted, is primarily about looking towards the future. And for Olmsted, the future was the establishment of government of great public grounds, such as Yosemite, for the free enjoyment of the people. And this really is the prescription for our national parks today. It is justified as a political duty. In other words, the government, it's part of the government's business to do this. He says it's a political duty, in fact, of grave importance. And it rests on the same base of equity and benevolence with all other duties of government. And these are two key words: his belief in equity, in fairness, in equality, and in benevolence, in government trying to do good by people. And this is a picture taken of Yosemite in 1862, just before the act was passed. And the great parade of the Grand Army of the Republic at the end of the Civil War to celebrate what they hoped would be a new future. And Olmsted hoped would bring about at least some of the changes that he's recommending here. Of course, not all this came about, and we know the history was a kind of a rocky road, but the first park was established with Yosemite and then followed by the Great Yellowstone National Park 7 years later. But Yellowstone has often been viewed, as I said before, as created by a group of rugged pioneers, explorers sitting around a campfire. Well, quite the contrary. I link the whole parks movement back to the Civil War, and the fact that the United States government grew enormously during the war in order to wage the war. New bureaus and arms of government were created. One example is the Pension Bureau. Another example is the first social welfare agency in the U.S. government ever had, which was the Freedmen's Bureau, to help people recover from the disruption caused by slavery and the war in the South. And so in 1866, immediately following the Union victory, the victory of the United States, the Freedmen's Bureau is created. The first Civil Rights Act is passed, and the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which guaranteed equal protection under the law, is passed. A year later, Congress starts to actively get engaged in Reconstruction in the South. In 1868, Ulysses Grant becomes president, and the 15th Amendment is passed, which is a guaranteed black male suffrage, the vote, in 1868. And in 1871, Congress passes the anti-Ku Klux Klan legislation, an attempt to suppress all the paramilitary violence that's a reaction to Reconstruction. And in 1872, Congress passes the Yellowstone Act. And Yellowstone is passed and made into a national park because it was a time when the Congress felt that the national government could do things it had never done before, and that included running and managing a national park. And so Yellowstone is not an isolated one-off that occurred because some pioneers thought it was a good idea. You have to look at it in the context of Reconstruction and as an act of reimagining what the national government should do, what its responsibilities should be. Now, why isn't this story told today? And I'm going to just very briefly mention a few things. One of which is that the story is not told today because when the National Park Service as an agency, as a bureau of government, came into being in the early part of the 20th century, there was a strong feeling in across the country, among white people in particular, that they didn't want to remember the Civil War. They embraced a kind of a mythic pro-Southern narrative. The movie Birth of the Nation was screened both in the White House and in Congress. It was a terribly racist movie. And just as this really forgetting about the war and its impacts was at its zenith, the national park legislation went through. So it's not a great surprise that a few years later, when the Lincoln Memorial in Washington is dedicated, this is a memorial to Abraham Lincoln. The seating for the opening ceremony is in fact segregated. This is the height of Jim Crow. And in fact, when the first national parks are opened in the southern United States in the 1920s, they actually have segregated facilities. And that exists well into the 1940s. So I'm going to just sum up here. Why were these early stories so compelling, these early mythical stories? It was useful to set aside the national parks from Central Park. The national park people, early national park publicists, didn't want to connect our national parks, which they claim were born in the West, with Central Park. They didn't want any association with Central Park. It was the height of this pro-South narrative, and they thought, as one historian has put it, that a virgin birth concept for the parks around a campfire in Yellowstone was untainted by any connection to the Civil War and emancipation. And later on, they looked to Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir as heroic conservationists, the father of the national parks. But this is an ahistorical, a non-historical narrative. This is not true. It was a much more complicated and inclusive story that we should be telling today. And I'll end there, and I'll just say that the Yosemite report is due to have for people to revisit it, because not only does it present a more inclusive history, but it's a caution against the privatization of these great public grounds. And it reinforces the basic duty and responsibility of government to protect them as a keystone institution of our democracy for all the American people. And I know I covered a lot of ground, but with that, I'm happy to answer some questions. And I'll return us now to the group. I didn't realize that's a lot of American history in 30 minutes. But hopefully it raises at least some questions in your minds if you ever wondered where did the National Park Service idea come from? Why do we call it America's best idea today?
Does anyone have any questions?
Sure, I'll jump in. Question, Rolf, is did you want to write this book at this particular moment now because of the just innate richness of the history, or also because of this to counteract some of the current revisionist thinking about national parks that frame them as entirely colonialist Western residue and racist in their entire character that has become somewhat popular of late?
Yeah, that's a very hard question to unpack. There are many parts to that, but I'll try, Tom. I think it has relevance to today, no question. That we're in an era where we're still fighting the same fight over the scope and role of government in society. This was not settled by the Civil War by any means. There are still forces out there who would downsize the national parks, if not privatize a segment of them today. That argument is, I mean, I'm talking in terms of the parks, but it's the argument that you can shrink government and wash it down a drain. And it's the argument that basically we should just reserve our tax dollars for national defense and, you know, a few other things, pay Social Security, but not much else. That argument still being, that conflict over federalism and states' rights is still very much alive today. It was not resolved by the Civil War, though a lot of people thought it would be resolved. Olmsted, in this 1865 report, thinks it's been resolved. He hopes it's been resolved. But in fact, it hasn't. And it wasn't. Reconstruction fell apart. It was not supported by the government. The government lost interest. The American people lost interest to some degree. And the national parks took a while to take root. And they had enough momentum coming out of the war with first with the Yosemite Act, but then with the creation of Yellowstone. And my argument is, as I said, that Yellowstone benefited from Reconstruction and the movement associated with constitutional reforms, the 14th and 15th Amendments, that it provided some momentum. In other words, it provided certainly a demonstration that government could do a lot of things, including running a national park system. But the basic argument still remains today is that this is a big system, it's complicated, it's expensive to run, and there are a lot of people who like to do it on the cheap, if not find an alternative to doing it at all. And that's just the way it is. So this book was written to some degree to say that this argument continues on today. In terms of the argument about the role of racism and its impact on the national park system, for a period of time, no question that race was an issue in the national parks. That was, a handful of parks were segregated. That's not known by a lot of people. They were integrated only after a great deal of protest, and only after a lot of people complained, including a lot of African Americans who went to the parks and were outraged that they were American taxpayers and these were public facilities supposedly owned by every citizen of the country, and they were segregated. The National Park Service today is interpreting that story. It's taken them the better part of half a century to sort of unearth it and talk about it, but they're doing it in a number of parks, such as Shenandoah, Fredericksburg, the two parks in particular. And I have to say that I think the Park Service as an agency has tried to work with Native Americans over the years, and certainly over my career, has made great strides in looking at opportunities for reconnecting Native populations to national parks, to provide opportunities for religious connections, also in some cases, even some limited co-management opportunities. There are some parks that were founded on co-management, such as Canyon de Chelly, which is Navajo land, a national park, but is co-managed with the Navajo Nation. So I think the national parks have tried to do a better job. I don't blame it on the national parks that, I don't think it's really fair to say that the national parks were responsible for the displacement of Native peoples. That in many cases that was happening, policy of the United States government writ large. And this land was later repurposed mostly for Western white settlement, but in some cases put aside for national parks. But you know, just the creation of Yosemite was not when the park was created, native populations were largely gone. There were a few people still in the valley, and they got involved in the tourism, early Yosemite tourism business, and were active in the valley into the 20th century. Very recently, the park worked with the local Miwok tribes, and they rebuilt one of the original native villages, Miwok villages, in the valley, and it just was done, opened a couple of years ago. So there are efforts to try to not only recognize that history, but do some amends for it. Does that cover more or less what you're asking, Tom?
Well, there's enough to chew on there for several more hours, or even a whole semester worth of content there. But that was very helpful, actually. Yes, very, very interesting.
Yeah, I don't mean to be so critical of the National Park Service. I think that they've been very negligent in terms of telling their own story, but maybe that's changing.
Yeah, the question was really getting to this point where what I see is sort of this ahistorical assault on the national park idea that has become so fashionable of late, not relative to these real specific historical problems with segregated parks and the like, but the kind of this recasting of conservation as being part of the suite of colonialist Western expansionist residue that swept aside the native peoples, which is just I think a fundamental wrong telling of that history.
Well, I think that
it's very is getting traction. As you know, David Truer's piece just in the last year is called for all of the national parks to be returned to native.
Yeah, I think obviously this is an article that was in Atlantic magazine on the proposition that let's turn all the national parks over back to native peoples. I think it was a rhetorical question, really. I don't think he was at all serious, but he wanted to create a conversation at least about the role of Native Americans in national parks today. And to the extent that that was his objective, I think he was reasonably successful. But I don't buy for a moment the argument that the early national parks, and some people would make this argument, were established as military outposts, so to speak, to subdue native peoples. I don't believe that's true. I think that's someone's wild interpretation. They were created for a variety of reasons, but for the recreation, for the railroads wanted national parks because they wanted to build hotels in national parks. There were a lot of early supporters of national parks. Women's clubs got very engaged in the creation of national parks, and in particular, the creation of a national park service, because they saw national parks as an agent of modernity and reform at a time of the progressive movement, when they were trying to clean up cities and create open spaces. And they thought the parks were the extension of this whole movement. And they were very active. I don't think this had anything to do with colonialization.
Are there any other questions?
George, you don't have a question? Okay. George is very helpful with helping me through the slides today. I appreciate that. Anyone else? Any question you ever had about national parks? This is your chance. Any place you ever wanted to go? Well, I encourage you all to use your parks. If this story leaves you with anything, it should leave you with the idea that the parks are a gift to all people, and they're a part of our democracy. They're a cornerstone of our democracy, an expression of the importance that every citizen has a piece of these lands. And they should take care of them, and they should use them and enjoy them. Because a lot of people fought very hard and gave a lot to create a country that could support a system of national parks like the United States has today.
Hi. I'm wondering if there are any area that is working, any of the parks that are working on co-management?
Co-management.
I think you said there were some that did have co-management.
Co-management. CO.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Geez, this isn't my specialty, but there's just a lot of consultation that goes on in the national parks between recognized tribes and national park superintendents. One example that where there's been a tremendous amount of consultation, for example, is what's called Devil's Tower, which is a religious site to a lot of Native Americans. It's also a great climbing mecca for rock climbers. And these are two clashing values. There are times when Native peoples want to have it closed off for spiritual and sacred purposes. And so it's been a constant many years of negotiation to find a way where their needs, spiritual needs, can be respected. Yet for the climbers, they can get some access because it's a very popular recreation destination. So Native peoples are deeply involved in that. The example I gave of Canyon de Chelly, that's the oldest. That dates back to the 1930s. But the biggest area of co-management, I think, would be Alaska, the Alaskan parks. When many of the Alaskan national parks were created in the 1980s as part of a big settlement of all federal lands when Alaska became a state, there was vast federal holdings. Many Native communities throughout these properties had traditional activities going on in them: hunting, fishing, trapping. So there was a settlement that involved setting aside a vast amount of this real estate for national parks, national refuges, national forests, for public lands. But they made sure that after extensive conversations, and you can call it co-management, that certain subsistence activities would be guaranteed to go into the future. In other words, if I know one example of a tribe that once a year there's a fish run in, I think it's up near Noatak, which is a national reserve, where the tribe is guaranteed access for its annual harvest. When the fish are released, the channel is open. These are traditional activities, and they're respected today. So it creates some tension because commercial hunters want access, but the law is written very specifically. It's for traditional, sustainable subsistence uses. So I'm sure there are many other examples. That's a big one because it really involves many different tribes and pretty substantial amount of land. Alaska parks are enormous.
Thank you.
Barb, you have a question?
How, I don't know how to frame it. How is the kind of the vagabond nature of, it seems that so many people in society now have given up their permanent homes and are in RVs, and they're traveling around from national park to national park. And how is that impacting the national park system?
That's a good question, just like that.
Yeah, well, I would call them roving visitors rather than vagabonds. But other than that, I couldn't agree with you more. It has an impact. The national parks, in fact, post-pandemic, have never been as heavily used in their history. I think it's partially due to the fact that European travels have been vastly reduced. More people are staying home, and more people want to get outdoors and connect to their parks and open spaces. But it does create problems, and what you do see, in particular, more than ever, and this is something that I hadn't in my career. This is just pretty recent. Is that a lot of parks are open by reservation. Certain activities are accessed. Muir Woods access is by reservation. You cannot drive through the gates of Muir Woods in California because you're in the area and you want to see a national park. You have to reserve a parking space. And more and more services are by reservation. I think even driving into Yosemite Valley is now on a reservation basis for certain times of the year. And this never was before. When I was growing up, I just, we'd hop in a car and we'd just drive into Yosemite. So
But I was thinking,
please.
Sorry. But I was also trying to get at the fact that these are basically people's homes. They're traveling in their homes,
Okay.
and they're expecting these communities, and they take up a lot of space. And how is that impacting the usage of the national park system?
I'm not sure I could really answer your question any more than anyone else can sort of guess at that. What they do use some services. On the other hand, the challenge of the national parks are to serve as many people as possible, but not at the expense of doing real damage. I mean, that's easier said than done, and that's really the great challenge. But I used to be a purist when I was a teenager in California. I used to think, if you can't walk into Yosemite, you shouldn't be visiting it. Or, I just thought that, people should have just only allow people to go in if they have very limited impact. And certainly that didn't really respect the needs of older people. It didn't respect the needs of people with disabilities of any sort. The national parks should be for all people. So I believe there's a place for the people with the trailers. And it's complicated because you can't have vast parking lots for RVs, but that's just going to have to be on a reservation basis. And when there's overflow, they go to another place. That's really what happens now. The National Park Service has lots of campgrounds, but I'd say that most people end up in a nearby national forest or Bureau of Land Management or some other location because the national parks themselves have very limited capacity. And that's not elastic. It can expand to a certain degree, but it can't expand indefinitely without doing real damage to the park. So I maybe that's, Barb, a little closer to an answer that's more relevant to your question. That's just a thought. I'm not an expert, at least on that issue.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I think we'll just end this. Thank you so much, Rolf. It's been really interesting, and we really appreciate your coming to talk to us. And good luck with your book tour.
Well, thank you very much, Jane, and thanks everyone for spending a little bit of your afternoon talking about They're your national parks. Now go out and enjoy them. Thank you.
Thank you.